It's 1588, and the greatest threat to Elizabeth I is coming, the Spanish Armada. In this week's History Calling video, the 14th and the last in my current Tudor Monarchs series, the end of the Tudor dynasty approaches as we look at the last 15 years of the life of Elizabeth I and learn how she dealt with the attempted Spanish invasion, then with the loss of her favourite Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and the rise and fall in her affections of his stepson Robert Deveraux, Earl of Essex. We'll finish with Elizabeth's own death in 1603, and with it the end of the golden age of Gloriana. Let's get to it. At the end of the last video, Elizabeth had just had her cousin Mary Queen of Scots executed, only to deny having intended to do so straight afterwards. With Mary dead, what had been the greatest threat to Elizabeth's throne was gone too. But now a new, even greater danger was on the horizon. In Spain, Elizabeth's one-time brother-in-law, Philip II, decided he had had enough of what he saw as his heretical sister-in-law, whose privateers, or pirates, including Sir Francis Drake, had been plundering Spanish ships for years and enriching themselves and Elizabeth at his expense. He decided it was time to invade England. The Armada had originally been intended for 1587, but Drake's actions ensured that it was delayed for a year. He attacked Spain's ships in Cadiz harbour that April and May in an episode known as the Singeing of the King of Spain's Beard, and destroyed many of their provisions as well as numerous boats. Still, despite Elizabeth's initial hopes that a diplomatic solution could be found, the face-off between the two countries was now inevitable. Elizabeth strengthened her navy and England's land defences, while Philip had the Armada rebuilt and provisioned, with the plan that it would sail up to Calais, where it would meet an army under the command of the Duke of Parma, which could then be used to invade England. The Armada left Corunna on the 12th of July 1588, and a week later it could be seen from the coast of Cornwall. The English had sailed out of Portsmouth on the 19th of July, and the next day they ranged themselves to the west of the almighty Armada. The two sides engaged, but they were too far apart for the English ships to do any real damage. The same happened again on the 23rd of July, and though the two fleets fought at closer range on the 25th, the Armada continued up the Channel towards Calais and Parma's army. Here it met with a serious problem, however. The Dutch were assisting the English and preventing Parma from getting his own ships out of port into the open sea where the Armada could have protected them, nor was Parma's army even ready to go. The man in control of the fleet, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, didn't know that his ally was delayed, however, and struggling to put out to sea. The Armada therefore anchored off Calais on the 27th of July and waited for their comrades. The English seized the opportunity to send 8 burning ships known as fire ships at the Spanish, causing them to panic, cut anchor, and scatter out to sea. It was a decisive turn of events. The English now reinforced their numbers with additional ships from home and proceeded to hammer the Spanish galleons. Numerous ships were sunk, disabled, or grounded on shore. If you follow the dotted line on this map, you can see what happened next. The remainder of the fleet was blown up the eastern side of England and Scotland, pursued by the English all the way to the Firth of Forth, which is near Edinburgh. Motivated by the promise of a hefty pension and an English dukedom, neither of which materialised, James VI had thrown in his lot with Elizabeth, promising not to give assistance to the Spanish, who were forced to sail around the top of Scotland, then south again on the other side, in the longest possible route home. Dozens more ships were then wrecked by storms on the shores of Ireland. 6,000 men were drowned, and many of those who made it ashore were then murdered by the Irish or the English Viceroy of Ireland and his men. Only a third of the Armada's men and less than half of its ships made it back to Spain, and the survivors were by then in a state of starvation. Still, in early August, Elizabeth couldn't yet be sure that the Armada would not be back, or that Parma wouldn't try to cross the Channel and invade without them, and so she had an army of 12,500 men under the command of the Earl of Leicester stationed at Tilbury in Essex, ready to engage. She visited these troops on the 9th of the month, and it was here that she made the most famous speech of her reign. On horseback and wearing an armoured breastplate over her white velvet dress, she said, "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes, for fear of treachery. But I assure you I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and good will of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for God and for my kingdom and my people, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you in the word of a prince they shall be duly paid you. In the meantime my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject, not doubting but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and by your valour in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of God, of my kingdom, and of my people. The crowd loved it, cheering loudly, and when a rumour came in that Parma was on his way, Elizabeth refused to leave her troops that night until it was evident that the Duke was not coming. In the event, he never would, and once it became clear that the threat was past, Elizabeth quickly demobilised her troops. The defeat of the Armada had been the greatest victory of her reign. Medals were struck to commemorate the event, which declared that God blew and they were scattered, a reference to the part the weather had played in the English victory. Elizabeth was also painted in the famous Armada portrait you see here, with her hand placed possessively on a globe, and her navy seen in the background defeating the Spanish. Later she wrote smugly to James VI of her thoughts on Philip of Spain, saying that he hath procured my greatest glory that meant my sorriest wrack. In 1590 Edmund Spenser published his poem The Fairy Queen, featuring Gloriana as the titular character, and soon it became a byword for the real queen. Her great glory had soon been followed by a great loss, however. Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who she had known since childhood, and who is widely considered to be the only man she ever truly loved, at least in the romantic sense, was now 56 years of age and in failing health. Once the threat of invasion had gone, he set out for Buxton Spa at the end of August to try to improve his condition. Stopping on the way, he wrote her this letter, praying for her good health. It was the last she would ever receive from him. Leicester died at Combury Park at 4 a.m. on the 4th of September. For Elizabeth, it was a heartbreaking blow and the end of an era. Supposedly she locked herself in her room for days, only emerging when her frantic servants had the doors broken down and she was beyond doing any business. She wrote the words "his last letter" on Leicester's final note to her and kept it till her death. Life had to carry on, though, and Elizabeth had nearly 15 years still in front of her. As the 1580s ended, she had a new favourite, Leicester's stepson, Robert Deveraux, Earl of Essex, who was born in 1565 and whose mother was Elizabeth's cousin, Lettice Knowles. Elizabeth had known Essex for several years already, and he had done much to restore her spirits after the depression which followed the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. When Leicester had been granted the post of Lord Steward in December 1587, Essex had been given his stepfather's former post of Master of the Horse, and after Leicester's death, Essex took over his formal apartments at court, close to the Queen. Essex was different to Elizabeth's other favourites. For one thing, people other than the Queen actually liked him, and he would be cheered in the streets of London. At the same time, he made enemies too, especially as he disliked the Queen showing marks of favour to others at court. Like all successful favourites, he was good at flattering the ageing Elizabeth, but as Anne Somerset has pointed out, he mistook the monarch's vanity and susceptibility to compliments as a sign that she was just as easily moulded in other fields. Essentially, he was immature, thought that he was smarter than he was, and didn't have enough respect for how clever and experienced Elizabeth was at ruling. He was warned by others to show more reverence to her, but instead he had spats with her which could descend into screaming matches, with the Earl storming off in a huff and threatening to retire from court, thereby depriving Elizabeth of his company. She was so taken with him, however, that when they quarrelled like this, she forgave him fairly easily, letting him away with more than other servants and even favourites could have risked. The result was that, like a spoilt child, Essex began to believe he could do as he liked without any real consequences. In April 1589, for instance, he left England without permission, joining a fleet which was meant to sail to Lisbon to destroy further Spanish ships, then land in Portugal to foment an uprising against Spanish authority. Elizabeth was furious and tried unsuccessfully to have him seized before he sailed away. The expedition then ended in a bungled mess in June, with between 3,500 and 11,000 men dead and tens of thousands of pounds expended on nothing. The Queen, who had heavily invested in the venture, was livid, but she forgave Essex, attributing his hot-headedness to his youth. Foreign policy was problematic in other areas too. The early 1590s saw an increasingly fractious relationship between France and Spain, and civil war in France after the throne went to the Protestant Henry IV. This led to Elizabeth offering financial and military support to Henry, but this ultimately achieved very little, leading to more wasted English money and lives. The French king then converted to Catholicism in 1593, which stabilised his position on his throne. Back in England, the cost of these military escapades, combined with poor harvests during the 1590s, led to a struggling economy and deprivations for the English, particularly amongst the poor. It was also in this decade that William Shakespeare came to London and began to make a name for himself, however, so at least it wasn't a total loss. At court, it was an era of change within Elizabeth's circle of advisers. Sir Francis Walsingham followed Leicester to the grave in 1590, as did Elizabeth's Lord Chancellor Christopher Hatton in 1591. That same year, Sir Walter Raleigh impregnated, then secretly married one of her ladies-in-waiting, Bess Throckmorton. When the Queen found out what he'd done in 1592, she had him placed under house arrest. Both husband and wife later spent a few months in the Tower of London, and it would be years before they were allowed back to court. William Cecil Lord Burghley was still there, not dying until 1598, but he was increasingly aided by his son Robert. Other newer faces also included, of course, the Earl of Essex, who developed a rivalry with the Cecils for Elizabeth's favour and largesse. The story of Essex would ultimately reach a messy end, however. Although the Earl was now a Privy Councillor, he remained immature and bratty, and spent much of the 1590s harassing Elizabeth to promote his friends to high office, often not getting his way and showing an inability to learn how best to handle the Queen. He did have a military victory in 1596 when he helmed a successful expedition to the Spanish town of Cadiz, which was seized and plundered by the English, but Elizabeth was incensed at the willy-nilly way in which he doled out knighthoods to those not able to financially support such a dignity, and angered that more of the treasure from Cadiz did not make its way back to her. She forgave him, but he further angered her the following year by botching an expedition to Spain to attack its navy because he ignored Elizabeth's orders and instead went sailing around the Azores hoping to find wealthy ships to attack and plunder. During this 3-month expedition, England was virtually defenceless from a naval point of view and was nearly attacked by another Spanish Armada, an outcome only avoided because bad weather forced the Spanish fleet to return to port. Essex went into another sulk at the fact that much of the blame for this was laid at his door, and because several of his court rivals, including Burghley's son Sir Robert Cecil and Lord Howard of Effingham, now Earl of Nottingham, had been advanced to higher offices during his absence. He refused to perform his official duties as a peer in the House of Lords, attend Privy Council meetings, or even come to court. And once again, rather than slap him down with an effective punishment, Elizabeth, despite her complaints about his behaviour, appeased him with gifts of additional offices of his own. Her indulgence of him had now reached dangerous levels, however. On the 1st of July 1598, Essex was in attendance on her along with Robert Cecil and Lord Nottingham, discussing who should be the new Lord Deputy of Ireland. When Elizabeth wouldn't bow to his demand that it be Sir George Carew, Essex turned his back on her, a serious affront to a queen, and she hit him around the head in retaliation. Essex then put his hand on his sword, screaming at her that he would not have put up with such treatment at the hands of Henry VIII, though I think had he reached for his weapon in front of Henry, his own head would have been on a spike soon afterwards. He then stormed off and left court, demanding that Elizabeth apologise to him. She refused and wouldn't see him, even after Lord Burleigh died in August and there was an uprising in Ireland. It was only after Essex was supposedly ill that she relented and allowed him back to court, though still, despite the thin ice he was on with her, he complained that she didn't make him master of the Court of Wards. In an effort to improve his standing with her once again, Essex now volunteered to go to Ireland to put down the rebels there, headed by the Earl of Tyrone. Elizabeth agreed, and he left London in March 1599 as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. The expedition was to cause the final rupture between them. Despite having a large army with him, he didn't march into the northern province of Ulster to subdue Lord Tyrone as he had insisted he would and had been ordered to do. Instead, he spent months wandering around the southern province of Leinster, wasting time and losing soldiers to illness and occasional small battles with locals. Elizabeth raged at him and ordered him to go to Ulster and do the job he had been sent to Ireland for. But instead, he squandered more time in the land to the west of the Peel, which was the area around Dublin controlled by the English, ultimately achieving very little. When he did finally venture into Ulster, he ended up meeting with Tyrone and negotiating a truce. He failed to tell Elizabeth what its terms were, however, and though she ordered him to remain in Ireland, he left on the 24th of September and arrived at her palace, Nonsuch, on the 28th, where, still caked in mud from his ride, he burst into her bedchamber unannounced when she was only just out of bed, still only partially dressed, and without her wig on. Elizabeth was shocked, but, wary in case Essex had plans to take the palace by force, she spoke calmly with him and lulled him into a false sense of security. Only later in the day, when she was sure that she was safe, did she have him interrogated for leaving his post without permission. He was then confined to his rooms on the 1st of October and placed under house arrest at York House, the home of the Lord Keeper Thomas Egerton. He was later moved to his own home in March 1600, and after being censured before a panel of judges and councillors at York House in June, he was stripped of most of his offices. He was only released from house arrest at the end of August and was barred from attending court. He was also now facing bankruptcy after years of overspending. His reaction was to plot treason. Essex's plan was to take Elizabeth's court and person by force in February 1601, then make the Queen replace his enemies amongst her advisers with his own supporters. He had the backing of numerous lords, including the Earls of Rutland and Bedford, but was remarkably lax about keeping the conspiracy secret, as the number of disreputable men he had coming and going from his home soon caught the attention of the Privy Council. 3 councillors and the Earl of Worcester went to him on the 8th of February, telling him to present himself at court. He refused to do so and instead took them hostage. He then took 200 to 300 armed men and headed for the court, hoping to attract further supporters from the city as he moved through the streets. He failed. He was publicly declared a traitor, and the Queen's men blocked the path to Whitehall Palace. He and his remaining men, for some had already abandoned him, fell back to Essex House, where he was forced to surrender that night. Elizabeth, for her part, had remained quite calm throughout the day, maintaining her usual routine even as the court around her panicked. There would be no forgiveness for Essex now, though. On the 19th of February, he was put on trial in Westminster Hall for treason and found guilty. Elizabeth, finally seeing him for the danger that he was, and recognising that it wasn't safe for her or her realm to let him live, showed none of the dithering which had marked her attitude towards the execution of either the Duke of Norfolk or Mary Queen of Scots decades earlier. Though it grieved her to do it, she promptly signed the death warrant on the 20th of February. The sentence was carried out on the 25th, when Essex was beheaded at the Tower of London, then buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, near Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was now reaching the end of her life too, and even her great nemesis, Philip II of Spain, was gone, having died in 1598. She still had one last great speech to give, though. Known as the Golden Speech, it came on the 30th of November 1601, when she addressed her final Parliament. It's too long to read out in its entirety here, but I'll leave a link to a transcription of it in the description box. In it, she spoke of her love for her people and her determination throughout her reign to do only what was best for them, noting the difficulties of her position by saying that, "To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it." Perhaps the most famous quote came from the end of her oration, though, in which she told her audience that, It is not my desire to live or reign longer than my life and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had and may have many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had nor shall have any that will love you better. Elizabeth was still in remarkably good physical and mental condition for her age, but it was clear that she knew the end was not far off. She was apparently in good spirits and health as late as February 1603, but at the end of that month things suddenly took a turn. Elizabeth sank into a depression upon the death of her cousin, the Countess of Nottingham, and soon she wasn't sleeping or eating, instead standing motionless for up to 15 hours. She refused the ministrations of her doctors and wouldn't even take to her bed, preferring to sit on a pile of cushions in her chambers at Richmond Palace when she finally couldn't stand any longer, and making little sound or movement. It was clear that she had lost the will to live. She was finally persuaded to go to bed on the 22nd of March and lost the power of speech the following day. The Archbishop of Canterbury came and prayed with her, and she hung on to his hand, keeping him with her on his knees until she finally slipped into unconsciousness. Elizabeth I, Queen of England and the last of the Tudor dynasty, died aged 69 between 2 and 3 a.m. on the 24th of March 1603. 7 hours later, James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, was proclaimed King of England on the streets of London. Elizabeth's body was taken to Whitehall to lie in state, then buried with great pomp on the 28th of April following the elaborate funeral procession you see here. Her tomb lies in Westminster Abbey and is well worth a look if you ever find yourself there. Ironically, given how at odds she was with them in her lifetime, she is buried close to both her sister Mary and their cousin Mary Queen of Scots, whose body was moved to the Abbey by King James. Elizabeth's had been the most unforgettable of lives and reigns. She had gone from a princess to the illegitimate daughter of a disgraced and executed mother to an abused teenager, then a prisoner in the Tower. She had made it to the throne against all the odds and ruled over England for over 44 years, imposing her will on those around her and refusing to bend to demands to marry, produce, or even name an heir, let alone intervene in foreign affairs when it didn't suit her. She could be vain, imperious and demanding, difficult to deal with, capable of cruelty when she felt the need of it, and sometimes so reluctant to act that it drove her advisers to distraction. Yet she was undoubtedly one of England's greatest monarchs, intelligent, cunning, manipulative, fiercely protective of her realm, and above all, a survivor. I think I'll finish her story with a quote from one of her enemies, Pope Sixtus V, who would happily have seen her dead, yet who had to admit in 1585 that "She certainly is a great queen, and were she only a Catholic, she would be our dearly beloved. Just look at how well she governs. She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, by all." I couldn't have said it better myself. I hope you've enjoyed this series on the Tudor monarchs. It's certainly been a bit of a marathon for me, I won't lie. I didn't think it would take this many videos to cover them, and in fact I still wasn't able to include everything I wanted to. I'll therefore definitely be doing other videos on them here on the channel, so please make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so you don't miss anything, and do consider giving this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and following me over on Instagram where my username is HistoryCalling. If you can't wait for more on this famous family, then check out the rest of the videos in this Tudor Monarchs playlist or my 6 Wives of Henry VIII playlist. They're also linked in the description box. Let me know in the comments section what you think Elizabeth's greatest achievement was, and until next time, keep learning.